Hello, everybody, and welcome to Lesson 8, Evaluating Sources in the CRAP Test. In just a minute, I'll talk about the CRAP test, what it is, why it's called that. Firstly, though, let's take a quick look at what we did last time, what we're doing this time, where we're going. So, as I mentioned several lessons ago, every lesson, lessons 6 through 9, contributes in some way to the final paper you're going to do the final draft of in lesson 10 when you finish out the course. Lesson 6 got you introduced to that assignment and what it's all about. That assignment has a research component, which is not something you've really done before, at least in this class. So lesson 7 and 8, this one, focus on the research process. Lesson 7 was basically how to find sources. So you could consider lesson 7 finding sources, lesson 8 evaluating sources. An important part of this final assignment we're working toward is that the research does not have to be scholarly. Later in this lesson, we'll talk a little bit more about the differences between scholarly and popular sources, but your research does not have to be scholarly. What that means is this class will better equip you for finding and evaluating all kinds of sources out there in the world whenever you're doing any kind of research project. Maybe a research project for another class. Maybe you're just trying to learn something, learn more about something. Maybe you're applying for a job. You want to learn more about that company. You have to do some research on it. So the tools you gain in these few lessons and use in your final paper will equip you to do all kinds of research. But what that means, what that involves, is you have to take more of a skeptical, more of a critical eye to the pieces of research you use in this paper than you've probably done before in other classes. This probably is a fairly new concept for most of you. So we're going to take a look at the same sample sources we looked at in the previous lesson, and we're going to ask the question, is this source credible? Should I use it in a paper I'm writing? And then we'll go through a series of steps that help you answer that question. And in the discussion board, I'm going to ask you to do the same thing with your own research. And then you'll know if you want to use that research on your final paper. Now, there are other questions involved, like such as, is this piece of research a good fit for my topic? That's not really the focus here. The focus here is it credible? So another way to say it would be after this lesson, after doing the discussion board, you'll know if you can use the sources you've been finding in your paper. So what is the CRAP test? And why would your professor show you a picture of a poop emoji right now? Well, whenever we teach an important subject, professors like to come up with ways to help you remember that skill or remember that subject you're learning about. And so obviously the poop emoji is going to stick in your memory because you'll be like, this is one of the only times a professor of mine used a poop emoji. But the letters stand, the letters CRAAP stand for important terms that are critical to understanding how to evaluate sources. And really the idea is we're asking the question, does this source pass the CRAP test or not? And so normally you don't want poop. You want to stay away from poop. It's smelly, it's bad. This test, as a skill you can learn and put in your toolbox, plays on that idea and reverses it because the C, R, A, and P are actually good things. These are qualities you want your sources to have. So the funny part is, if the source is crap, then it means it's credible. So it's almost like a reverse pun. But hopefully that'll help it stick in your memory. That's the idea. Let's see what these 5 letters are, what these qualities are. So credibility, this is where you can look to the author and the publisher of the piece and see what their credentials are. Do they have good ethos? Are they credible? Reliability is where you consider the information or the evidence presented by the source. So you can investigate it. Where did they get their information? does this seem reliable? Authority is related to credibility. You could think of credibility as like the whole piece. That's why it's the first letter. You're basically at the end of this evaluation checking a box saying yes or no to credibility. So authority would also involve looking into the author and the publisher. Accuracy, again, if maybe it's quoting facts or statistics or something, you can read other articles and see if those numbers line up. Is the information in it accurate? And finally, purpose. This may be the most important one, but the hardest one to ascertain. This is asking the question, why did the person write the piece? So you can investigate that. What are their motives? What are their goals? Maybe they have ulterior motives. Maybe there's some kind of bias. Maybe they're just trying to present you with certain information. Now, even if a writer is very biased, that does not automatically mean the source is not reliable. Answering each one of these a certain way does not automatically disqualify it from passing the credibility test. But each one is an important factor. So what you want to do is investigate all of these and then carefully consider each one, the role it plays in the ultimate piece of writing you have in front of you, and then decide yes or no, this is credible and reliable enough to use. So you consider each one as an important factor, and once you consider all of them, you make the final determination: is this credible and reliable? Yes or no, I will or will not use it. And a writer can have bias. Really, all writing that makes an argument is biased. It's just we ask the question: does the bias affect the credibility and reliability of information? A person can be very driven by their opinions and their beliefs, as we should be. We should be passionate about things. Um, but if we want to make an eloquent, articulate case for our stance and persuade others and create change, then we have to find good information, use it wisely and logically. So investigating the purpose can tell us a lot about the piece was written, why the piece was written, but finding certain things doesn't automatically disqualify it. It can, but not always. So this involves a lot of critical thinking. And it may seem like really like a lot of critical thinking, but that's sort of the point. We live in a culture of disinformation, misinformation, fake news, people claiming things are true that are simply not true. And we have to weave through all of that now as we read articles and cruise the web and look at social media and see advertisements and watch shows. We're presented with all kinds of information that is presented as true. But in this day and age, in this culture, it's not always true. And so these skills are really applicable beyond this class, beyond even the research process. They're applicable to life in general, to just navigating media and culture on a daily basis, as we all do. And if you take English 201 from me, I place an even greater emphasis on that. In my English 201 class, we actually spend most of the quarter analyzing pieces to see if what they present is credible, reliable, ultimately true or not. So if you're interested in that, you may want to take English 201 from me, but that's all to say I can't overstate the importance of learning these skills in today's culture. And again, the way you remember this is the source is supposed to be crap. Does it pass the smell test? Does it smell like poo? Here you actually want it to. Kind of a reversal, again, just to help you remember. So last lesson, I showed you how to find sources, and we found 3 sources on Black Panther for kind of a sample, like hypothetical paper I'm like imagining to write. For the purpose of these lessons is to demonstrate to you what to do, because it's the kind of paper I'm looking for you to write for this class. So to show this, illustrate this skill I've been talking about, let's take a look at these 3 pieces and see if they pass the test. So the first one was the scholarly source. Remember, scholarly source has a few qualities. It's peer-reviewed, which means other experts in the field have done a blind reading, not knowing who the author was, and given their approval before it was published. And they're usually published by a press, a publisher that's associated with a university. And so those qualities make it scholarly. Now, for the most part, we can assume scholarly sources are credible. But I'm still going to do this exercise because in this day and age, I think we should just apply these skills to anything we read. And oftentimes, um, the people who write fake news are so good at what they do, they make it look very credible. Maybe they even make it look scholarly. So we really have to be really thorough and circumspect. That's why we're going to practice these skills even with the scholarly sources. And as you're learning research, this way you can further learn about the differences between scholarly and popular sources. And remember, in your paper, you can use a combination of both, and you must use some of each so that you learn the difference, and you must use at least one popular source. You can't use all scholarly sources in your paper because I really want you to learn these skills and apply them. I want you to discern if something is credible before you put it in the paper. All right, let's practice the crap test with the scholarly source one. So I actually have a document. It was your only reading this week because this is kind of a big discussion board post. I'm asking you to do a little bit more than normal, and it's worth more points than normal. So the reading was less, and it's just this one worksheet. This worksheet is really a way to do the crap test, and I actually got this from the EW library. So if you look at this, you can see at the bottom, there's some places to just put in the information about the article, but at the top, there's several questions. The authority, so who wrote it, who published it, and then the evidence, what kind of evidence do they use? So the way this relates to the crap test is if you answer those first two questions about authority, you're basically saying, is this credible? Are the publisher and the author, are they authoritative? Are they credible? And then answering the question about the evidence, you're saying, is this reliable? Is it accurate? So if you fill this out, you'll basically have answered the question, does it pass the crap test? Let's see if our first article does or not. So if you look at the bottom there, you can see I filled in the information. The author's name is Robert LaRue. The article was, I Remember You Was Conflicted, Reflections on Black Panther, the African American / African Divide and Scholarly Positionings. Let's investigate each of these things. So here is the author. It says right there, Robert LaRue, PhD, assistant professor. His research includes these topics. And he is the author of several articles and has published several book chapters. So he seems like a pretty credible person. And the fact that they present this information up front and don't try to hide it is a. So here I filled that in on the worksheet. Professor with a doctorate has published multiple articles and book chapters. In his research, those articles and book chapters are on multi-ethnic literature, is the term that was used there. And so that would make sense since we're talking specifically about Black Panther. In my specific topic for my hypothetical paper, the relations between African and African American cultures. So that's important because, as you see, I have in parentheses there, that's a relevant field of study. If it said he was a professor with his PhD who published articles and chapters on art history of the Renaissance period, I'd be like, well, what does that have to do with Black Panther? And so that comes back to the idea of relevance and how relevant the information is to the topic. So not only is this guy an expert, he's an expert in the right field. So I'm pretty sure we can check the box that the author is credible. So let's move on and look at the publisher now. it's called Africology, the Journal of Pan-African Studies. That word pan means all in ancient Greek, so it's like all things African, not just one African country or culture. And if you read the first sentence of the description there, and now this, so actually what I did, I should say, is I typed in Journal of Pan-African Studies into Google and found their home site so I can find more information about them. The author's information was on the actual article itself. The journals was not, so I had to look that up. But you can easily research the author in the article. We'll see some examples of each. So the first sentence there says that this journal is a transdisciplinary, online, peer-reviewed, scholarly journal devoted to the intellectual synthesis of research, scholarship, and critical thought on the African experience around the world. Since our inception in 1987, we have so on and so forth. So a few key pieces of information here. They're peer-reviewed, scholarly, and they've been around for over 30 years, quite a long time. So this seems very, and that's what I put on here. Just like the author, it's credible, reliable, and relevant, right? It's a journal on African studies for a movie that's about African culture. So credible, reliable, relevant. Both the author and the publisher passed the CRAP test. To round out our evaluation here, let's not just look at the author and the publisher, but also the actual evidence, the actual content. Because you could have an article, a piece of writing that the author and the publisher are great, but you look at the actual content and it's not very good. So this third piece here, the evidence and the reliability, the accuracy of the evidence is very important. Make a quick note about this. How do we know if evidence we see is accurate and reliable? There's two main things you can do. One is you can look up other sources. Go to other sources and see if they present the same or similar information that would substantiate the idea that it is credible and reliable information. If you can't find anything else that presents the same information, then it might not be credible. Two, you can rely on prior knowledge. Now, this depends on how much of an expert you are. I have two things I'm working with here. One is the African American and African divide. The other is the movie Black Panther. Now, I don't know a lot about African American and African relations. That's a topic I'm excited to learn more about as I do this research process. So I can't really use my prior knowledge to evaluate what a source says about that as being reliable and accurate evidence. But I love the movie Black Panther. I've read lots of Black Panther comic books. I've seen it multiple times. I can definitely evaluate if what an article says about Black Panther is reliable and accurate. And that will probably be true for you because your paper, like mine, has two parts. So there's the real world issue and the cultural artifact. Even if you know a lot about the real world issue, I'd still like it if you approach it as something you don't know a lot about. Approach it with a very open mind. We talked about that in lessons 6 and 7. But the cultural artifact, I'm assuming you picked something you're passionate about, and that's great. Because if you're reading an article that talks about your cultural artifact and what it's saying does not make sense, it probably doesn't pass the CRAP test. And you're able to, discern that yourself. So that's one reason why, for many reasons, but one of them is why I included the cultural artifact as part of this assignment. So let's look at the articles out. So I skimmed back through it, which you'll want to do anyway, because you might want to use some quotes or something. And I found a quote. While T'Challa, that's the main character, that's Black Panther's regular name, not a superhero name, is very rightly presented as the noble protagonist and is set up as the film's titular character to be the fulfillment of those desires for affirmation, Killmonger also fulfills those desires from across the divide over which he and T'Challa fight. So I know this. I've seen this movie. I know that the characters do indeed represent these things, and they are They're basically, they want the same thing, but they have different means of going about it. And the conflict is over not the goal, but the means of achieving the goal. So I know this is an accurate statement about the film, and that my assessment I'm going to conclude between the authority and the credibility of the author and the publisher, and the accuracy and the reliability of that evidence, because it's an accurate statement about the central conflict in the film. I'm going to say, yes, this first source passes the crap test. If I want to, if it fits with my argument, yes, I can use it in the paper. Now let's look at our second source and do the same thing. This source is also scholarly. So for my paper, I have two scholarly and one popular, which you can do, or you can have two popular as long as you have some of each. But this source I found using Google Scholar rather than the EW library when I demonstrated the research process in the last lesson. So I'm going to be a little more involved here. I'm going to dig a little deeper, even though it is scholarly, to really ascertain its credibility. So same thing. I've got the information down there. The author is A. David Lewis, if you look in the bottom right, and the article is The Ancestral Lands of Black Panther and Killmonger Unburied. And the publisher is the Journal of Religion and Film. So let's research these three things: the author, the publisher, and the content of the article itself, and see if they pass the crap test. So here is A. David Lewis, and it didn't have a ton of information on the journal itself like the previous one did. Some journals have author information, some don't. So just like for the last one, how I researched the publisher, this one I'm researching the author. Here's what I found when I looked him up online. He's a graphic novelist, a college educator, which means like a professor basically, and comic studies scholar. He has a PhD in religion and literature, and he's on and on. So this seems really credible and relevant. Come back to that point, right? So the journal is religion and film, and his degree is in religion and literature. Film and literature are very similar subjects. So there's a lot here that makes sense. And there's a spiritual element to what goes on between T'Challa and Killmonger. So that's why I'm using this piece as one of my three sources. And so this really fits well. Not only is he a professor with a PhD, but he's a comic studies scholar, and he writes graphic novels himself. And Black Panther is based on a comic book. So this person seems like a great, very authoritative, credible source to use. And I wanted to just study further, so I looked up. That's to say, I just want to be really thorough, since I found this source on Google Scholar instead of the library. So I'm going to look up to see what else this guy has published. And another reason for that is when I found his own webpage, that could be misinformation, right? Someone could have like made that up, like he could have, and made a fake page. That's what people do with fake news. So it's good to just do a little bit more research to find one or two or more other sources that confirm the information you have. So I use this resource called academia.edu. It's kind of like Facebook for professors. And I looked up all his publications on there. And you can see he has indeed published on religion and superheroes in numerous journals. And so he indeed has published in the areas he has. So the information he presented on his website is true. So I'm going to conclude that the author is reliable and credible, authoritative as a source after doing several, not just one, several pieces of research, looking up his information and then confirming it elsewhere. I'm even going to go one step further and look up one of the books. In this, so I'm not just going to the author now, I'm going to the publisher, Bloomsbury, which is an academic press. And one of his books, he's written on comic books and graphic novels and religion, is called Graven Images. And so this is indeed a real book published by an academic press that he wrote. So I've looked in 3 places now, confirmed he's a legitimate scholar in 3 places, so he must truly be a legitimate scholar. I think that's enough to conclude. Say yes, he's a professor with a PhD, scholarly publications on comics, religion, and film. All right, we're good to go. How about the Journal of Religion and Film? As you can see right there, this is published by the University of Nebraska at Omaha. So it's published by University Press. That means it's also peer-reviewed, just like the Journal of Pan-African Studies. It's on film. Black Panther is a film, and like I said, there's the spiritual element that'll be part of my paper. So this is all relevant, authoritative, accurate. It's a university press. I'm going to conclude that yes, not only the author, but also the publisher passes the smell test. Since I was able to find all that on their website, and their website was a university and it looked authentic, I'm going to go ahead and say that's enough research for the publisher. How about the evidence? Again, I'm going to skim the article and find a quote. This quote says, a number of early reviews of Black Panther have centered on the moral conflict at the center of the film. This is great because that morality connects to what I was saying about spirituality and religion, because that is typically the source of our morality. And I know that indeed that's the conflict of the movie, to connect to the previous piece, right? That there's a moral element to the debate T'Challa and Killmonger have over about the means of how to carry out their goals. I'm going to say yes, the evidence, because again, I know the movie from my own experience, the evidence is reliable and accurate. This question is a central question about the film, and it's the question that guides this article. So I'm going to say the information is accurate and reliable. And so now I've checked all 3 boxes, and I think this article, even though I found it on Google Scholar, is also credible, and if I want to, I can use it in my paper. Finally, we're going to look at a popular source. Now, this one will be a little bit different, and we're going to dig the deepest here of our 3 sources, since this is the one that doesn't have those scholarly credentials to back it up. We should always investigate sources, even scholarly sources, but popular sources without those credentials, we have to dig even deeper and farther. So let's do that. I found the source on Vox. So in addition to the author in the title, I've also put the URL there. Like I was saying, this is the popular source I found online, so I've got the URL there. So we're going to investigate all 3 of these things again, the author, the publisher, and the evidence in the article, but much more thoroughly than with the first 2, since this is a popular source. Okay, so the author, again, I Googled him and found his page. His name's Trey Johnson. He's focused on race, class, and culture. It says that right there. So immediately, race, class, and culture, I know what he does write on is relevant to Black Panther. And then it says his work has appeared in Rolling Stone, Vox, Atlanta Black Star, and other outlets. And even though those are not scholarly sources, they are magazines or online journals that have been around a long time and established a reputation for themselves as being, for the most part, pretty credible. They're not scholarly, they're not peer-reviewed, they write about popular culture, things that are popular that many people are interested in, but they're known for being fairly credible on those things. And I can click over to the publications tab if I want, see his publications, and then Google those to make sure the information he's presented here is factual. So he's published in some significant places on relevant research, and I can fact check all of that, so it seems pretty credible. But I am going to go over to that publications tab and see. And look, he's written about Avengers Infinity War. He's written about, well, multiple pieces on Black Panther if you scroll down there, and you can see where these were published. So they're all well-established journals, and so I can Google those and see. So a pretty accomplished writer, lots of people have said this person's writing is worthwhile, it's worth publishing. These are not blogs or things he has self-published. Even if they're not peer-reviewed, whoever edits the journal has looked at this and said, this is good, we should publish it. So that's a pretty strong show of credibility, right? And then here is the piece itself. So now we can start to research Vox, the journal. But first, I'm going to go ahead and put here, because he's published numerous articles on the subject, race and comic books, and major magazines, especially Rolling Stone's pretty credible publication. I'm going to check the box and say yes, Trey Johnson is credible and reliable, authoritative as the author of the article. Okay, back to researching Vox. The reason I showed that slide is we have to really research the publisher here. You know, I pretty thoroughly researched the author of the previous articles. That wasn't new to you, but I because those last two were scholarly journals, I didn't research them much. Vox, though, does not have those credentials, so let's really research it. Here's what they say about themselves. They say they explain the news is their mission statement, which means they're trying to contextualize it. If you read the news, what you're reading doesn't always make sense. So they're not just going to report the news, they're going to try to give more context to make the information in the news clearer. And they also publish a lot of pop culture. So that's what they say their mission is. But let's do a little more. These are the people who own the journal and started it. Ezra Klein, and then there's a couple more we'll look up in a minute. But you can see he is, according to Wikipedia, a journalist, blogger, political commentator. So he's got a history in the media. So that makes him pretty reliable as a founder of Vox. Two quick notes. Why we're looking at the people who founded this is it's not a scholarly journal. So we have to do more research, just like we did more research for the author. So just like we researched who the author is, we're researching who the founders, the owners of this journal are, since the journal itself, we need to go to outside authorities to see if it's reliable. And the first of the few people who founded it has a background in news media. So that seems pretty credible. And the second note I wanted to make is about Wikipedia. Obviously, you don't want to cite Wikipedia in a paper for a class, but because it's informal, not so much because it's inaccurate. Anyone can edit Wikipedia, so they can certainly present fake information on Wikipedia, but the majority of the time, most of the time, the information on Wikipedia is credible. It's informal, it's not professional, so you don't want to use it in the paper. But if you're just trying to learn more about a person or a publisher or even a subject, if you're new to that subject, Wikipedia is a great place to do some basic research. The likelihood that someone would go on Wikipedia and make up fake information about Ezra Klein is very unlikely. He's just not well known enough in the media. Even if you had a bigger figure someone wanted to make up stuff about, they usually don't do it on Wikipedia. They usually create a fake news webpage of their own devoted to it. So for the most part, you can trust Wikipedia, especially when you're looking up basic information like this. Just don't cite it in a paper. Let's look at who some of the other founders of Melissa Bell. They don't have her picture, but similar background in, there's her picture down there. Background in journalism. And Matthew Iglesias, same thing. They all have experience with reputable news sites, like he has experience with The Atlantic specifically, and long history in the media industry, so they are authoritative, at least with news media, in terms of founding a news media site. So it seems like between looking at the site itself and the people who founded it, that so far it's passing the test. More research. So now I'm going to look up Vox, the journal itself, on Wikipedia. And here it says that Vox's mission is to explain the news, which is, so they're quoting the Vox site. But again, we have that established in two places now, Vox itself and Wikipedia. So what is my ultimate conclusion? From Wikipedia, I learned that Vox is left-leaning, which I don't like. simply because I don't like anything to be too biased. If a journal's political bias, because they all have political biases, but if a journal's political bias is so well known that that information is included on the journal's Wikipedia site, then that's probably a degree of bias that's well known enough that that's going to give me concern. I want unbiased information, whether it's left wing or right wing. I want it unbiased. But it's hard to avoid bias completely on these kinds of sites. Most journals really have political biases. I mean, those scholarly peer-reviewed sources were probably left-leaning as well. So this comes back to what I talked about with the idea of purpose. They have a bias, but what was their purpose in writing the piece? As you'll see in a minute when I investigate the evidence, this author's purpose was to show how Black Panther is this groundbreaking achievement for Black culture that's previously unprecedented in cinema, at least in the superhero genre. And all of his arguments he makes about Black Panther are very credible. So even though they have a bias, this journal, that doesn't really come through in this article. The article is presenting an important thesis with accurate evidence about Black Panther. So we should know these biases. And if there was something in this article that was like a far left perspective, and I ever felt like reading the article was trying to manipulate or persuade me, then I would use this piece of information to maybe swing the other way and say it's not credible. But combining this piece of information with the content of the article, as you'll see in a minute, I'm still going to come to the conclusion that it's credible. So like I was saying with the crap test, you need to gather all of these pieces of evidence and weigh them together. And it's not like a piece is going to check all the boxes perfectly. But as long as it checks a good number of them and overall the information there is credible and reliable, you can use it. Now, if you were researching something you didn't know anything about, like you were uninformed about both the real world issue and the cultural artifact, as a hypothetical example, then you'd want to pay more attention to this kind of bias and do further research. Basically, as you do the crap test, do research and find 2 or 3 pieces of evidence to establish each criterion, if it's credible or not, each quality, if it has that. And if you come across something like it's left-leaning or right-leaning or something else that gives you pause, then do more research. And that further research may either establish its credibility or not, but basically keep researching until you come to a conclusion, would be the way I would say that. And the last thing I'll say here about Vox is, even if it's left-leaning, which really gives me pause, and I don't like that, its goal is to provide context for news stories. Now, that context could manipulate people to a left-leaning stance on a news issue, and I'd want to avoid that. But I think for the most part, it's a noble goal of trying to make news more relatable, more understandable. So I like their goal, and I think plenty of times there's pieces on Vox, I would say, are not credible, that you shouldn't use. But plenty of times there's good pieces on it too, and this Black Panther one is an example of that. So since this gives me pause for my further research, what I'm going to do is look at the article itself and look at it. And this is the quote I like here. Black Panther is in many ways a love letter to Black culture. Africa has traditionally been an unsophisticated bit player in American media, often portrayed as backwards, savage, and chaotic in everything from news coverage to films. It's a portrayal that has left little room for other interpretations, which is why Black Panther's vision of Wakanda as a bustling metropolis of vibranium powdered, futuristic skyscrapers, racing trains, and soaring spaceships feels so refreshing. So I know 2 things are true. I know there's 2 parts to this claim. One, that Africa has been portrayed a certain way in news media up to this point in film, and that Black Panther does it in a different way. I know enough about the portrayal of Africa in film, and I know enough about Black Panther to know both of these things are true. So even though this journal has kind of a bias, I don't see that bias in this particular article, at least not to a significant extent. not to an extent where I feel like they're trying to manipulate me. And I know this statement and other statements later in the article are true about Black Panther and about the representation of Africa in film. So I'm going to go ahead, based on this evidence that it is a credible, reliable article. I certainly have reservations about Vox, and I wouldn't want to trust everything from Vox. I'd want to evaluate each piece individually, but I'm going to conclude this piece is credible and I can use it in my paper. So now I've got my three sources for my paper. In lesson 7, I found them, and in lesson 8, I proved they were credible. Now I can go ahead and use them in my paper. So hopefully this was a helpful lesson in that sense. For the discussion board post, I've asked you to find 3 pieces of research similar to the ones I found. And remember, they can be on the real world issue or the cultural artifact or both. I found all of mine on the cultural artifact because there's a lot out there on Black Panther. Yours may not have as much, and you may need to go to the real world issue for your sources, but find 3 sources. If you haven't already, you were basically supposed to find them as part of lesson 7, but if you haven't already, find 3 sources and then do this test. You can fill out the worksheet if you want. You don't have to. The worksheet's kind of like a pre-writing exercise, but in your discussion board post, write 3 short paragraphs. They can total 500 words, so they can vary in length, but 3 short paragraphs, one on each source, where you say this source is credible or this source is not credible because, and explain your answer. In that way, you'll either have your 3 sources for the final paper, or if they're not credible, you'll be a step closer. And that's the step we're doing in this lesson to get you ready for that final paper. So as always, I look forward to reading your posts, and let me know if you have any questions about the assignment.